Hey everyone, welcome to Startup Talks. Today we're doing something a little different. One startup, start to finish, all in one episode. The startup is called Jibo. It was a social robot. It raised $73 million. It is no longer with us. So I had to look this up, and I want to make sure I describe it right. Jibo was a robot about 30 centimeters tall, 3 rotating segments, a little screen for a face, cameras, microphones, speakers. Its personality was officially described as a smart, responsive 12-year-old boy, which honestly sounds exhausting. But okay.
I have questions already, but go on.
It could answer questions, tell stories to kids, recognize faces, start conversations on its own, take family photos, and dance. It danced. That's a real feature they built and shipped.
And this came out of MIT?
MIT Media Lab. Professor Cynthia Briezil. 20 years of research on how robots can support elderly people and children with autism. Very serious science. The CEO was Steve Chambers, former president of Nuance Communications, the company whose speech recognition technology was behind early Siri. So this wasn't a garage project. These were credentialed people with a real research foundation.
That makes the ending more interesting, not less?
Right. So they run a crowdfunding campaign in 2014, pre-order at $599, delivery promised by end of 2015. They sell 40,800 units against a target of 3,000. Everyone celebrates.
I wouldn't celebrate that. A crowdfunding campaign is a test of how good your video is. You're selling a promise, not a product. The real test is what happens when people actually get the thing.
That's a very important distinction that they did not make. They raised $27 million off the back of that campaign. Total funding over the company's life, $73 million.
And what was the original idea before the pivot?
Originally, it was a companion robot for elderly people, but healthcare investors said the tech was too complex, and general investors said there was no money in elder care. So they pivoted to Family Companion. Jibo lives in the kitchen and helps teenagers and parents actually talk to each other.
Which is a real problem, and also a very optimistic theory of how teenagers work.
Okay, so here's where it falls apart. They projected that component costs might run about 2.5 times over budget. They ended up 4 times over. They projected the timeline might slip by about 2x, also 4 times over. Jibo launched in September 2017, nearly 2 years late, at $899. They had pre-sold it at $599.
So the people who believed in them earliest got the worst deal.
2 specific things caused most of the delay. First, the facial recognition sensors were calibrated for office lighting, bright, even light. Home lighting is completely different, warmer, darker, variable. They had to replace the sensors, which meant redesigning the circuit board, changing the power system, rebuilding the thermal management. Months of extra work, right there.
And when you change one component in hardware, it cascades. More power draw means more heat, means different battery, means different weight. Everything is connected.
Second problem. Almost everything had to run on the device itself. In 2014, cloud AI that could handle real-time face tracking and emotion recognition didn't really exist yet. So they needed expensive chips, which meant brutal constraints on size, power, and cost. Steve Chambers said they lost over a year just figuring out what runs on the device versus what goes to the cloud.
They were building hardware in the exact window right before the cloud made that problem much easier. 1 year later, and this is a completely different project.
And then 2 things happened that nobody planned for. First, in May 2017, Chambers was diagnosed with leukemia and left immediately. He was the person who kept raising capital while the development stretched on. He recovered, but too late to come back.
So the fundraising engine goes down at the worst possible moment.
Second, Amazon Echo launched in November 2014, while Jibo was still in development. $200, voice assistant, Amazon's entire retail machine behind it. By the time Jibo shipped at $890, it was facing a $700 price disadvantage against a competitor with infinite resources.
And it turned out people mostly wanted to set a timer and play music. You don't need emotional recognition for that. You don't need a robot that dances.
Revenue in the first year, about $5 million. They had spent $73 million getting there. They couldn't raise again, couldn't find a buyer willing to keep the lights on, bankrupt in June 2018. And then in 2019, when they shut down the servers, the robot delivered its own farewell message to the people who had it on their kitchen counter.
That's the saddest product shutdown I've ever heard of.
It thanked people for keeping it around and said it hoped someday robots would be in every home. Then it went dark. So I want to name two patterns here because they show up everywhere, not just in Jibo. I'm going to call them bugs. Bug 1, building in isolation from users.
Meaning you have a strong belief that your product is needed, but you're not actually testing that belief against reality.
Exactly. Jibo spent years adding features without a real feedback loop from people who had paid and were using the thing. The crowdfunding wasn't a product market fit signal, it was a marketing signal. By the time actual customers had actual units, there was no mechanism to turn their experience into product decisions. Churn was predictable, nobody measured it.
And if they'd had that loop running when Echo launched, the obvious move is to strip hardware aggressively, cut features, cut cost, get to a price where your advantages actually matter. But you can only do that if customers are telling you what they use. Without that signal, you just keep building what you believe in.
Bug 2. Treating features as a cure for weak sales. When sales are slow, a lot of founders think the answer is more features, more capabilities, more wow. This is almost never correct. It's like opening a restaurant, realizing it's quiet on Tuesday nights, and deciding the solution is to add 17 new dishes to the menu.
When really, the question is why people aren't coming back on Tuesdays.
Exactly. Product-led growth only works once you've solved retention. If people aren't sticking around, more features just make the product more expensive to build and maintain. The real question is always, what do customers need to justify paying this price? And that question can only be answered by talking to customers. But here's what I keep getting stuck on. All of this is obvious in hindsight, so why don't founders just go talk to customers?
Because going to market means getting rejected. And getting rejected at scale is something most people genuinely cannot handle.
Walk me through that.
We're all trained from childhood to ask what will work. School, parenting, professional training, it's all additive. You learn what to do and you do it. But sales is the opposite. Sales requires asking what will not work and then collecting 1,000 rejections to figure out what to eliminate. That's a completely different way of thinking, and most people were never taught it.
So when a founder takes their product to market and gets rejected, it doesn't land as data. It lands as, I am incompetent. I don't belong here.
Right. And someone who has spent 20 years building expertise around an idea cannot psychologically absorb that message. So they go back to the lab. They add a feature. They do something that feels like progress without exposing themselves to another rejection.
And you can't talk them out of it. Knowing what to do doesn't change the behavior. The blocker is identity, not information.
The only way out is repeated exposure. You have to get rejected enough times that it stops meaning something about who you are. That's a trained capacity. It doesn't come from a lecture. It comes from doing it until it doesn't hurt the same way.
Which means the question for any founder isn't just, do you understand the market? It's, can you survive the market telling you no? Those are very different questions. That's all for today. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode of Startup Talks.